No, I'll do it on the computer. Okay, I think we're live now. Or not live, but recording at least. All right, hello, everybody. Welcome or welcome back. I'm Micah. Those of you who are new or just forgot and need an update, I'm Micah Edvenson. I'm a philosophy graduate student at the University of Florida, as well as a graduate teaching assistant, focus on philosophy of biology, psychology, and language. And I'm joined today by Mao. And we're going to be talking about I language, generative grammar, um, some more general points about the interaction between linguistics and particularly syntax, what he works on, and philosophy. So you're currently a PhD student at University of Maryland, correct? And you came from
That's right.
Oxford. So yeah,
Yeah.
let me, I guess I'll let you introduce yourself actually. So yeah, who you are, what you work on, and why you like it.
I'm Malhaar Shah. I'm a PhD student in linguistics at UMD. I've just entered my third year, and I work mostly on syntax and its interfaces with morphology or word formation and semantics. And I also do some experimental semantic work. Pleased to be
Very cool. Yeah, thank you for joining me. This is actually your idea, so great stuff. Um, okay, so you probably be more equipped than me to give kind of a overview of what we're going to be talking about. So we're talking about this kind of theoretical concept originating with Noam Chomsky of an I language, where I is a kind of stands for this tripartite conjunction of intentional, internal, and individual. So that's going to be kind of the framework for our discussion. But in that, we're going to be talking about other distinctions in syntax, like the competence performance distinction, talk about generative, or maybe even more specifically, say transformational grammar, universal grammar. But before we kind of get into and then I should say we'll end up eventually talking about the stuff that's more in my wheelhouse, which is the kind of what implications these things may or may not have for philosophical thought experiments and philosophical understandings of language. Um, but kind of before I guess we get into the weeds on that, we should kind of do some framing. And this is where you would probably be better than me. So I guess there's this kind of central question from one of the papers you sent me is sort of a good place to start, which is we're faced with this question of what is the proper object or what are the proper objects of linguistic study. Um, and as far as I understand it, the certain camp that you're a fan of, what's sometimes called the essentialists or generative grammarians, the answer is I language. But in order to talk about why that's an interesting answer, I guess we should talk about the questions as well as what we're talking about. So yeah, what's generative grammar? Sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you, I know. So feel free to take this in any way you want. But what is it we're talking about, and how did we kind of get here conceptually?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is sort of striking in most discussions of philosophy of language is surprisingly, what is a language is not a central question, at least in the literature. Like people will discuss meaning and interpretation, the relation of context to interpretation, and things much more than they discuss what a language is. And if under a certain reading of uh, 20th century philosophy of language, I think that's kind of natural because really what they were concerned with was not language, like it was either logic or thought generally, systems of communication, but not something that say uh, like traffic lights and body language don't have in common with like the level of generality sometimes spoken at will group those with what we're doing right now. And linguists sometimes think that and sometimes don't, depending on um, what sort of level we were working at. What was like even in the history of linguistics, what was not recognized for a long time was actually, I shouldn't say that, it was recognized, but if you say pick up Saussure, so this is before the cognitive revolution and things, he has a very explicit discussion of um, the role of the individual in linguistic studies, and he says, look, what you and I do, like we don't really speak English. We'll like make mistakes. We'll do all sorts of stuff that's peculiar to us. I have an accent. You have an accent. Um, but he said none of that is like what the real objects of study is. For him, that was all parole. It was like to be filtered out. That's mere psychology. Whereas really what was to be studied is like long, which is that would be like French or English, right? And I think you get something a little bit like this in Michael Dummett's view. But the with a shift towards making psychology the real object of study, that like what we're doing when we're studying language is studying what a human being knows about a language. Um, that naturally brought about a shift to seeing language as like something that's in individual heads, literally something that's going on within the brain, right? So it took a while for people to see that. Even at the start of generative grammar, it wasn't like immediately realized. It took, I think, until 1986 to actually sort of state it in those terms of we're doing individual psychology. And these notions like French, English, Russian, etc., they're somehow derivative of individual psychology. That's what's in my head and what's in your head. They're similar but not the same. But those things that are different between us, they come first. English is some downstream abstraction from that. So that I think that's the answer to the question of what where like I language sort of started to enter the picture. What generative grammar is I think a little bit broader than that, insofar as what it's trying to do is in fact the same thing every grammar has tried to do. Like what you do when you pick up French, like at school, is or whatever it is, you go in for a class and they teach you these rules. The whole aim is to basically construct a device that allows you to take a sentence and say, this sentence, yep, sentence of French, this one isn't. They'll offer explanations for that. For example, you'll often get very semantic explanations offered, like the reason this sentential construction looks the way it does is because it's intended to convey this meaning. Like French subjunctives turn up because the meaning intended is like something that's somehow abstract. It's not quite real. It's something else. Sometimes that's the right sort of explanation. Sometimes it's not. But the aim is the same, of basically just telling you, here are the rules for constructing a sentence of language. Generative grammar, because of the way the sort of intellectual environment in which it grew up, also concerns itself with more psychological problems, like the problem of language acquisition. So that grammar has to be of a certain format so that it explains how a kid could have learned it. And also trying to explain, like your grammar of French can't look very different from your grammar of Japanese. Like the grammar has to be similar enough such that those languages, it can't be like two completely different things. You have to see what's common between them as well. But that's something of that I feel like that was a half answer to like each of the questions, but I don't know if there's anything in there that you want to particularly build on.
Yeah, no, I mean that's my fault for giving you multiple questions at once. Yes, I mean we're I guess like historically, but even now, I suppose. I mean, this is one thing I wanted to talk to you about because I don't really know much about like the state of play in linguistics in terms of like how much, like how commonplace this sort of framework is, um, as opposed to because I know at least at one point there were at least like three like major camps. But I guess so if we're talking going back to like the question I posed at first, like when we're talking about what the proper object of
Mm-hmm.
linguistic study is. So I think Chomsky was kind of the first to make this point that like, well, language just as the phenomenon of people talking to each other is like way too broad of a thing to study. So like that's not what we're doing. And I
Yeah.
guess one thing that distinguishes this view from others is that, uh, he really wants like a scientific approach to the study of language as opposed to, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, like a taxonomical one, I guess you'd call it or something. So I guess that's one question. Like, is the I language answer rather to this question like the linguist's answer, or is there still like debate about this? I think I'm jumping like around a little bit in like asking different questions. So sorry, but I guess that's one way of framing it. Like, yeah, this I language, this scientific or biolinguistic, um, study of language. Is this like commonplace now amongst like syntacticians, or are there still debates over this? Because I part as far as I understand it, like Chomsky's the main influence, but you still have detractors.
Yeah. So I mean, Chomsky's made uh, to handle that sort of part first. Chomsky's made contributions at sort of various levels of linguistics. And with iLanguage, we're talking about a very foundational level. So just because you mentioned it earlier, for example, transformational grammar, not all grammars are transformational. Some grammars will, not all generative grammars are transformational even. Uh, so you can just do with phrase structure rules that'll generate a sort of a tree for the sentence and then have nothing that like manipulates it after the fact. Um, you can have a sort of generative grammar internal dispute about whether those grammars are right or not, but that's a step down from the iLanguage question. And when it comes to look, what are we doing? Are we doing psychology or not? That I think within syntax, I think that's almost consensus. There are some notable critics, but with the other fields like say, well, semantics is the most prominent one where I think people are sort of more consciously ambivalent about what they're studying. That there's a notable Barbara Patti essay about look, is semantics mathematics or psychology? And you know that like semanticists, I think, will often be happier to sit on the fence with that question. Syntacticians often are more sort of resolute in uh, the psychological commitments of the theory. There are people who think we can just study expressions, you know, as formal objects. And that's, you know, it's fine. Like you can get good results the same way, but it leaves a number of questions unanswered. So um, if you think about, say, well, so with an iLanguage, of course, the internal part is usually what's brought up with a connection to psychology, that it's something mentally represented in the mind. Um, but even the intentional part of like, there's a particular procedure. So it's of course intentional with an S. The point here is that this characterization is going to be something that distinguishes, say, like I don't know if I can do the maths for this off the fly, like x squared minus 6x plus 9 from like x plus 3, x minus 3. So those are going to differ in intension, but not in extension. They generate the same graph, but like if I give you a really big number, the procedure for um, actually like calculating a particular point is way easier for one than it is for another. Like for the first one, you don't, sorry, for the factorized one, you don't have to square a really big number, for example. You might have to multiply two big numbers, but like um, it's not there's no squaring involved. So the steps you take are different. And generative grammars sort of try and make different cuts, even if they generate the same set of sentences. They'll try and uh, they might have different procedures for generating those sentences, and that kind of thing is where the psychology is really important, because then there's a sort of empirical question. Well, if we have these various procedures for generating the same outputs for the same inputs, which algorithm is it that the human brain is running, right? So you can do all sorts of things to try and find that out.
Cool. Okay, good. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'm sure we'll come back to that too, this kind of notion of extensional versus
Yeah.
intentional equivalence, both with S's, um, as we know, because I
Okay.
know we'll talk about like Quine and stuff, but
Uh,
sorry, did you have something else?
yeah. What was the second part of the question? So there was Chomsky's particular claim. Oh, whether it has detractors. Sorry.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. So the people who think there are formal objects, often they'll dispute this way of putting things. So Jeff Pullum is a notable proponent of a model theoretic syntax where you can simply just state constraints, and anything that satisfies those constraints counts as a well-formed syntactic object, uh, rather than having to state a procedure that generates all and only the grammatical sentences of the language. So, that second way of looking at things is, I think, the most common among syntacticians, but it's, that's the thing that sometimes gets disputed.
Okay. Good, good. Yeah, that was all right. Oh, okay. So this helps bring us kind of neatly into a question I had, or I think a point it would be good to like it helps in this context of talking about alternative views and whatnot. So as I've kind of framed things so far, and correct me at any point if I'm wrong on any of this, but the way I've framed things so far in this discussion has been like, well, we're talking about I language and I guess I language more specifically. Um,
Mhm.
more precisely as a sort of answer to this question about like what the role of study for linguists should be. It's like scientific and it's
Yeah.
so and we'll talk a little bit about like that includes like factors that make up like speaker hearer competence and like we'll probably talk
Yeah.
about that in a second. But um so I guess it's worth like discussing at this point. I'm kind of curious. This is the thing I'm curious about. Um like how do I say, guess syntacticians, but more interestingly, how do you view um the roles of like semantics and pragmatics. So there's obviously this famous like distinction between
Yeah.
syntax and semantics, and every once in a while pragmatics gets thrown on there. These different properties language has, like the ways, I guess broadly speaking, the ways it's organized, what it means, and then how it's actually spoken, performed. I mean, that's a very rough and ready summarization of that distinction. But I guess there's a question like it's partially methodological, but I guess there probably are implications for how you actually think about language in terms of like, yeah, sorry, this is a terrible question. How do you view that distinction as a syntactician? Like,
Yeah.
what is the role of, or I guess more precisely, what's the role of semantics? Because in study and pragmatics, but I guess semantics would be more closely tied to what you do. So, um, do syntacticians, like in this Chomskyan tradition, sort of think of these other parts as derivative, like secondary to linguistic study, or is it just like kind of a different face of the same coin, or how would you put it?
So, um, maybe we should have maybe I should have started like with this, but I think it's helpful to think about syntax um, as the thing that, pairs sounds and meanings. That's so a sentence isn't just if you just because it came up, like if you read Quine or something, sometimes it's really unclear what he thinks a sentence is. So sometimes it almost feels like he's just talking about a string of sounds, um, rather than uh, anything else. But crucially, that it's a meaningful sound. Like the fact that uh, like the um, the man called the politician from Texas, it can mean that the politician is from Texas. It can mean that the call came from Texas. It can't mean that the man is from Texas. It makes no comment on whether the man is from Texas. Um, so there's something that tells you that sound, uh, that string of sounds, that can have one meaning, it can have another meaning, but there's a meaning it can't have. In fact, there are many meanings it can't have. Um, Literal meanings, I should say. But the interesting thing there is like, okay, why? So what an I language is basically your procedure for putting these two things together, right? For getting from the sound to the meanings it can have and back. So uh, syntax, it's often brought up that syntax is autonomous from semantics, usually brought up with phrases like colorless green ideas leap furiously, that it's a meaningless string that's syntactically fine. Um, it's autonomous from semantics in the sense that the rules of syntax don't make reference to semantic well-formedness. Like the rules of syntax that a preposition, has to have a noun after it makes no reference to meaning. But uh, the idea that the syntactic outputs have something to do with the meanings and the sounds, that's sort of a triviality. So syntax is in one sense autonomous, but not in another, that it has to crucially depend on semantics in one way. Because it is the thing that simply takes semantics and puts it together with phonology, sound. So I don't know if that's clear at all, but uh, the notion that syntax is totally autonomous, I actually think that's only come about very, very recently, and I'm not sure if it's something most syntacticians sort of really believe. And certainly the kinds of things that were meant by autonomy of syntax back in the day, that's not, it wasn't that like syntax has nothing to do with semantics. That wasn't the claim. Um, with pragmatics, I think there's also a lot of interesting work. Like, um, for example, the conditions between, I mean, if you think of syntax again very broadly as just the thing that pairs sounds and meanings, that like you get these very particular uh, uses of intonation, for example, and I don't just mean like rising intonation to indicate a question, but like it's a very elaborate process of, um, suppose you ask a question like, uh, why are you learning Italian? And then someone replies like, my wife's Italian. That's um, there's I think I produced it wrong. Like the normal way of saying the sentence in isolation is just my wife's Italian, but like that's a super strange way to answer the question, just because of that slight placement of intonation and like the stress has to shift to my wife's Italian. Um, so there's all sorts of these really intricate connections between the context and how we place stress, or you know, uh, that has to be mediated by syntax somehow. So again, pragmatics is playing a serious role in how we connect meanings to sounds. It's all kind of in there somewhere. What doesn't happen so much though is again the notion that syntactic well-formedness is driven by pragmatics. So it can't, and you do get these cases where focusing improves a sentence or something like that, but like um, in general, the grammaticality of a sentence is determined by syntactic factors, not meaning. So there's some autonomy, but not total autonomy. Or there's autonomy in one sense, but dependence in another. That might be a better.
Okay. Good, good. Yeah, I mean, so the what you said about semantics near the beginning, I was thinking about, is it one way to like understand it as thinking of there being syntactical constraints on like possible meanings of a sentence? Like when you gave the example of like, well, it could have this meaning or this meaning, but it can't have this one. So like,
Yeah.
is that okay? Just making sure I'm tracking. And then I was thinking something else with that, like different, oh, along like similar lines, like the same question, but maybe stressed a bit differently. Are there differences in terms of like what your syntactical theory is? In some cases, I imagine has implications. Maybe it doesn't, like, not a determining relation, but it probably has implications for how you think about word meanings. And I don't want to get ahead of myself because we're eventually going to talk about like word meanings as psychological versus social entities when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about philosophy. But to gloss it a bit here, I'd imagine having an I language approach um, to syntax is going to at least imply or give support to like a certain understanding of what semantics is. Or so is that right? Is there, does an I language like research program in syntax have implications directly for semantics, or is it more so just a view about the production of language and syntactical structures, and then the semantics questions are sort of on their own.
So I certainly don't think that the I-language perspective is restricted to syntax. I think you can, there's a lot of good I-language
Right.
work on phonology, for example. So uh, there's nothing, I mean, for you and me, it's very obvious, like my phonological rules and accent and so on are extremely different to yours. Um, I mean, now that I've been living in America for a while, it's sort of softened, but like, um, uh, clearly there's something about individual psychology there, and the nature of the phonological rules as they are in my head would just need to be studied like in my own terms. Um, if someone wanted to know uh, what English phonology is, it would have to be an abstraction. With semantics, the difference is, of course, these sort of philosophical issues about, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but like these philosophical issues about what meanings are. And if people are right, as they've sort of argued for more than they have in the domain of sound, um, if meanings are sort of intrinsically social, then there would be a real question about whether the I-language perspective is extensible to semantics. Um, and certainly there are people who think you can be an I-language syntactician and think, look, everyone's syntax grammar is totally different, and you could do, you could do syntax for a brain in a vat, but you couldn't do semantics for a brain in the vat, even with a full syntactic description. Now, what the what syntax would be doing then, and when I said what it does is map phonology to semantics, is it might be mapping phonology to something, but not quite semantics, not true semantics. It would be sort of a proto-semantics, which the full view of linguistic semantics would, it would have to integrate context and stuff. I mean, we can talk more about this later, but I think that's a sense in which there sometimes isn't as much of a disagreement between sort of semantic internalists or like I-language semantics and externalist semantics as sometimes claimed. But we can come back to that. Yeah.
Okay, good, good. Thank you. Yeah, and I'm sure we will. Sure we'll get to that. So I move a little bit more, and I guess discussing a little bit of the more of the details of I language. But I guess first we should probably say something, or should ask you something at least about this competence performance distinction that
Mm-hmm.
Chomsky came up with. And I guess it also, I didn't do a good job of framing this earlier, but I'll try to clean up a bit now of like talking about I language as opposed to like, language, because there's this sort
Mm-hmm.
of history of Chomsky talking about like the object of linguistic study being an ideal speaker in an ideal environment, and
Yeah.
that coming under criticism because people being like, oh, well, language is messy. And it's like, well, yes, of course. But when we're talking about language as like an object of study in terms of what he's thinking, that's when we're talking about I language. So I
Right.
guess that's a way in which the I language is like the I language versus language distinction starts to map on a little bit to, or at least be influenced by this sort of competence performance distinction, like what
Mm-hmm.
a speaker would have to know in order to like produce the grammatical utterances they do versus how they actually speak in practice.
Yeah.
But I guess I still have a fairly loose understanding of this. So, like the distinction between I language and language, and then like what is the relation of that distinction but to this competence performance distinction?
So I think they're different distinctions. I'll start with that. The competence performance distinction is one of um, the sort of most foundational things in all of cognitive science, I think. I don't think it's limited to um, I don't think it's limited to syntax or linguistics, but even in vision, audition, whatever it is you want to study, it's sort of relevant. So the competence performance distinction, at least as formulated for language, was the idea that look, a speaker knows stuff about their language. Um, when putting that to use, So when, actually going to say something or trying to understand something, stuff goes wrong all the time. We we freeze like I just did. We um we reach for the wrong word. Uh, you can't remember words sometimes. Um, and the errors can be systematic too. They don't have to be these one-off things that sort of everyone has, but like suppose someone has a stutter, it's it's a systematic sort of, it's not an error, but it's a distortion of their language, right? It's not what they intend to produce or something. And if you think about them, their knowledge are actually not just underwriting their language production, but also language comprehension. Um, like it's not like people who have a stutter can only understand stutters, right? Um, and being someone who doesn't speak with a stutter, it's not like I can't understand a stutter. So the linguistic knowledge is actually, reasonably far removed from what we actually say. Well, even if you sort of really want to dig down into it, then what we actually say in terms of the pure acoustics, it's completely um, it's completely different. Like when you're just having a conversation, like the thing actually hitting your ears is like people walking, others talking, like trucks going by in the background, and like there's something that we think corresponds to the sentence, but there's like a huge amount of abstraction involved in like the raw data, sense data, to getting to the linguistic thing. So competence is basically the thing that allows you to do that, and performance is your ability to put it to use and stuff. That's it. Whether that distinction was meant as like a sharp distinction, I think is really unclear. Like, it's not that there's, well, to put it one way, that it's not like there's two things. Um, to an extent, performance reflects competence, and obviously competence is involved in performance. But the question of whether there's sort of a language knowing system and a language using system, I think that's like very murky, and it would be very surprising if that turned out to be true. What um, what's more likely true, I think, is there's the competence system, sometimes called the grammar, and what the parser is, that's usually what people call the performance system, is just the grammar plus like everything else. It's the grammar plus your motor systems to coordinate your tongue and your lips and so on. It's your grammar plus your auditory systems, all of that, vision, if you're a sign language user. So it's there you have all the things Chomsky mentions in that famous paragraph from the first pages of aspects. You have memory limitations, you have other stuff going on. And like, in terms of our theories about performance, they range from like, you're screwing up because you have like a neurological deficit or like brain damage or something, to you have peanut butter in your mouth. Like, all of that counts as like a performance theory, I think, in a real sense. Um, there are cases where it's systematic, like kids make all sorts of errors because they have pretty weak attention spans, and a lot of like their working memory is a lot more limited. But that's sort of, that all goes into explaining performance errors. Um, Competence is what we're trying to sort of get to really. So there's a lot of performance we have to ignore. Well, not ignore, but idealize from, and you have to be careful in idealizing from it. But that's the, I don't know if that makes sense. If there's
Yeah.
anything I should, yeah,
No, it totally makes sense. I wonder, I think am I right in thinking that the distinction partially had to be clarified because, some people did and maybe do, I don't know, the, again, state of play, or at least in philosophy, I guess, definitely there was at least um, a denial of like even the idea of competence, like there being something deeper beyond
yeah,
um, like language use, or I mean, what might have been at certain points called pragmatics, or I guess historically it would have been called verbal behavior.
yeah,
Um, So yeah, I mean, other, I guess, yeah, is that right? Like that there was at least at one point like a denial that there was anything deeper to language use that either produced
Yeah,
it or was like underlying it.
yeah. So you're definitely right that mentalism was like one of the big things that allowed, I think even in that passage where Chomsky defines competence, he says like, look, this is what shows that linguistic theory is mentalistic in a technical sense, that we're committed to mental reality underlying behavior. So it's that behavior was not just to be, that was the data, but the explanation would not simply be behavior. So if you, take Quine or something, knowing the meaning of a word simply is like definitionally is a disposition to respond in a certain way. So there's no mental reality unless, depending on what you think dispositions are, I suppose, but like really everything is defined in behavioral terms. Whereas here, there's a real shift to like, we're going to talk about representation. There's symbols in the head that are manipulated by a computational device. We can talk about the brain in computational terms, and competence is like it's a description of those symbols, um, or at least some of those. Like they might include a phrase structure grammar, they might include a transformation, they might whatever. Um, and it wasn't just going to say like, look, knowing the meaning of this sentence is like to respond in this way. Knowing the meaning of a sentence would be to mentally represent something. So it's to have competence. With pragmatics, I think that one is kind of tricky because uh, uh, like pragmatics is sort of it's always there. So when you get people into so when things get messy, like when syntactic judgments become difficult, you have to start doing experiments, and that's usually what people call studying performance. Pragmatics seeps through all of that always. People are facing the experimental tasks in certain ways. They have expectations about what the experimenter wants from them, all of that. So, you know, I don't think it's a real question about like whether pragmatics is a part of performance or a part of competence, because clearly we know things that allow us to um, interpret people's like contextual meanings, that all the good stuff about implicature, and um, that I think that's the clearest example. But it's sort of always there in performance is the point. The Yeah. Um,
Good.
sorry, just about how it relates to the I language, E language distinction. So Chomsky's contrast is not I language with language, but with E language. And E language is it's a set of sentences extensionally defined and often external. So this would be something like suppose you took French to be the corpus of French sentences. That's, it's a set, you can count them. Like people haven't said an infinite number of French sentences. They could say an infinite number of French sentences, but they haven't. And then if you say like that's French, that's the objective study, you get a very different field to, you know, Chomskyan linguistics. Um, you get like corpus linguistics, which is considered as a field rather than a method. Um, and this is, I think, again, like long, Saussure's long, like Dummett's languages and stuff. They fall more into this kind of idea of like there's something out there that we can grasp. It's not super clear to me that Platonic views like Frege's would fall into that too. Frege's for meaning at least, but Katz had a view that was that this English out there in Platonic heaven. Um, I don't know if that falls super neatly into the IAE split, but the point was with I language, um, this is something that I think the clearest illustration of this is suppose we did a judgment task. We did an experiment in English about, look, we're going to give people a bunch of sentences and they're going to give us judgments about whether they think they're good sentences of English or not. Um, and you get participant, like imagine there's a scale here going from 1 to 7. Participant A rates this one 7, participant B rates this one 6, 7, 7, 5, 7 again. Which one tells me about English? Like, it's not the average, that doesn't tell me anything. Like, what your data is ultimately from individuals. Your data is ultimately about individuals, about their own grammars. Of course, that data is going to be clouded by performance. Like they might think a good sentence is bad or a bad sentence is good for various reasons, like to do with memory limitations and whatnot. Happens to all of us. But the um, but the data is always about individuals' grammars. So I think that's the claim when, look, this is the measurable thing. So in that sense, language being the scientific object of study cuts right across the competence performance distinction. Because whether you're doing experiments or whether you're getting like controlled judgments or whatever it is, it's the same introspective judgments. It's always about an individual's grammar. Um, that's just where the data is coming from.
Okay, good, good. Yeah, that I kind of glossed over this part as well, but like that individual part of the I in I language being like, well, there are essentially as many languages as there are speakers, right? Because none are going to be syntactically identical. Um, and if we're just talking about like, yeah, this extensional definition, the set of just,
Mm-hmm.
well, every sentence that could be produced, um, that's just not something you can scientifically study. I think Chomsky makes that point. This kind of puts like kind of moves us nicely into talking a little bit more about like the I language stuff as well as results from that. But
Mm-hmm.
one more like one thing on the competence performance we talked about. Um, I mentioned this idea that I've seen before that like, well, there's nothing deeper to language than just performance. And I guess going along with that, and you kind of answered this a little bit already in the example you just gave, but just to make it like really clear, there's an alternative idea. I don't know if it's popular anymore, but there at least was that like, well, what counts as a grammatical utterance is like almost an inductive claim about
Mm-hmm.
like what most speakers would
Right.
count as grammatical, or like, they're going to learn this based on like an input and however many, whatever they get, the more types of utterance, that's what's going to count as grammatical for them. Like there was this idea, I guess, that like performance almost determined competence in a weird way.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that wrong?
So
Determines is probably a bad way to put it, but
well,
yeah.
it's so that there's a sense in which I think it's kind of obviously true. In that if you have a baby and it grows up in an English speaking environment, the kinds of sentences it will think are okay, sentences like the cat sat on the mat, and not, for example, a sentence of Japanese. Uh, you know, so that's like I think that's kind of a triviality, but the there's this other notion that grammaticality has to do with frequency. I don't know how much people would genuinely defend this because of, well, this point that Chomsky and others have like repeatedly made, that like that's most of what we say we've never heard before. Um, what's interesting, I think, is it people often emphasize, look, there has to be this kind of interesting language specific thing about learning about language acquisition, the universal grammar and whatnot, because there's little negative evidence. And by negative evidence, what I mean is um, corrections. So if a kid says, I don't know, like I bring my toys home, and the parent goes, no, it's brought, it's not bring. Uh, kid Normally kids don't care. actually. Like as a point of fact, they'll just go on saying whatever, and then eventually it somehow corrects itself. But the uh, that very rarely happens. Like especially with syntax, you don't get told which sentences are wrong. Um, and for syntacticians, that's where most of the data comes from. So syntacticians always sort of ask questions like, "Isn't it interesting how you can't say like, um, who did you wonder if who did you wonder whether John likes is kind of weird as a sentence. It's way worse than who did you say that John likes." Um, so that kind of question is like what keeps syntacticians up at night. Like, why is it that the rules don't allow you to generate this? Um, that's where insights about the grammar come from. And of course, that's what kids don't get. They simply don't hear the bad sentences. Oh, well, modulo performance errors, but like there's a lot of bad sentences they don't hear. There's also a lot of good sentences they don't hear. So, in fact, there's like infinitely many good sentences they don't hear, and there's infinitely many bad sentences they don't hear. Somehow they still manage to converge on the right grammars, but or at least close enough to right. But the point here is just when it comes to determining what's grammatical, there's a lot of evidence involved in there's a lot of evidence in what's not being said. So, for example, English doesn't allow you to delete subjects. You can't say something like, um, John went home, uh, wanted to turn on the stove. Like you can if it's a continuation of the same sentence.
Yeah.
But you can't just say like, what did John do? Wanted to turn on the stove. It's a little weird. In Italian and stuff, that's fine. You certainly can't do it with objects in English, and you can in plenty of languages. You can just delete them. Now, kids who are hearing English growing up, they never try and delete a subject or something, or they don't get told, look, you can't delete a subject in this language. If you were learning Italian, you could have, but what's more likely is the kids' reasoning is sort of a Bayesian thing where like, look, if the language I was speaking allowed subject drop, I would have heard a subject drop sentence by now. So why haven't I heard one? It must be that um, that my language doesn't allow subject drop. So in terms of the determination of what's grammatical, i.e., of what the rules of the language allow, kids are not only reasoning about performance, they're reasoning about what's not in performance. So, it's completely outstripped by that. Yeah.
Okay, good. That makes a lot of sense. Um, thank you. That's all clearer. So I guess at this point we can kind of delve a little bit deeper into like the I language stuff. But before we do, I guess I should ask you, given that this is more your area than mine, is there anything else we should cover as far as like backdrop? I mean, we're obviously not getting a chance to talk about like the whole of Chomsky and linguistics here, like,
Yeah.
but some of that stuff's more common, like poverty, the stimulus argument, and generative grammar, like universal grammar. Um, but if we're going to talk a
Yeah.
bit more specifically, what do you think?
I mean, it might be worth just dwelling on the universal grammar point, and that I think it's sort of important that I language, one of the things that I doesn't connote is innate. Um, that an I language is the sort of endpoint of acquisition, um, what's sometimes called the steady state. But I don't know if that's a very helpful term in actual practice, but the I language you can think of as the product of putting universal grammar and your linguistic input when you're doing language acquisition, putting those two things together, that's what gives you your I language. So, there's many ways of studying the I language. You can think about the UG contribution to I language. You can think about the variation involved. Um, So like, either you can think about what's common to all languages, or you can think about what varies across languages, and both are a really valuable contribution to studying I language. Um, so you get all this rich work, particularly on like romance. You get all these like tiny pronoun like things where you can say something like I saw John, but like I him saw, and they move around the sentence. Um, but what's super interesting is the rules for this thing vary all over the place. So you get this really rich work that's like, look, in this town in northern Italy, here are the rules for the placement of these pronoun like things, clitics. And you go like 10 kilometers to the west, and here are the rules there, and it's like completely different. So again, like it's all I language. It's this individualistic study of what's what people think the rules of their particular idiolect are. But in the end, it tells you how like what the structure of the grammar is for everyone. Um, so that yeah, I think that's like a something that's um, sometimes missed because Chomsky linguistics is so defined by the commitment to UG that like um, the rich work on variation sometimes gets lost. But the I language perspective, I think, like puts that front and center in a way.
That's okay. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think so too. As far as what I've read about it, that's always been stressed. Like the differences almost tell you more or as much about like the underlying grammar as the similarities do. And that's part of what you're also trying to answer is like what, uh, how much our language is able to vary. Like what are the constraints on variation as well as similarity.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it does seem perfectly all, not perfectly, but all very tied up together in a nice way.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a good framing, I think. We've talked a lot about I language and like a little bit about what it is and sort of how it applies to some of these things and differs, but I guess we'll delve a little bit more into it now. I want to learn more about, I guess, like developments in the theory, but maybe that's a good place to start in terms of framing this discussion of I languages. If you had to put it in a nutshell, because I know you're a fan and like I've heard you talk about it before as like this, it's like one of the super important idea, really radical, or maybe not radical, but really important at least. So if you had to put it in a nutshell, why was and is the idea of I language so important and interesting, fruitful, take whatever adjective? What's so great about it?
Yeah. I mean, I think for one thing, the results that we seem to actually get more in when we think about the procedure. So, the procedure that generates the sentences. Like, if you just think about language as a list of sentences and try and generate those, it's actually pretty tricky because because it's a finite list. So if you just take a simple verb in English like think, um, you get like John, John likes football. Bill thinks John likes football. Mary thinks Bill thinks John likes football, and so on. If you try and uh, this is like one of those classic illustrations of like linguistic infinity, right? Or like well, missile means a missile, anti-missile means a missile that like hits missiles. Anti-missile means a missile that hits anti-missiles. So on. It's really easy to write that rule. If I have, in a phrase structure grammar, I just need like sentence goes to noun verb, right? And well, verb phrase. Verb phrase goes to verb object. Sometimes that object is a sentence. So verb phrase goes to verb sentence. And that's all I need to say. Immediately, I get the possibility that you can take a sentence and stick it in another sentence and stick a sentence in that sentence. I get that for free, right? So just by allowing reference to like a sentence inside a rule, a rewrite rule, um, you can just do the recursion and keep going. thinking about the procedure then allows you to like state that very elegantly. If you think about just the sentences that are generated, and like you want to constrain that somehow rather than like generate a finite list, a list and extension or something, it's really hard to come up with any rules because the rules so quickly accidentally get you into infinity, right? Like writing a grammar that only allows you to like speakers in actual practice won't embed, more than 2 or 3 times. Writing a grammar that allows you to embed only 2 or 3 times is much harder than writing a grammar that allows you to embed to infinity. So if you think about the language as the rules that generate the sentence, that all sort of comes, it becomes very clear that that's what's going on with people. What they have is not a list of sentences. It's it has to be these rules. Like thinking in procedural terms, I think is one of the big insights. In terms of the individualism and stuff, like what what that gets you out of is these endless debates about like, look, so and so said this sentence is bad in the language I'm studying. Say it's Spanish. Like I asked this guy and he said this sentence is bad, and I asked this lady and she said the sentence is good. Which one of them is right? Well, they can both be right, and in fact, probably both are. What that is evidence that they have different high languages. And in that way, it also kind of gives a perspective on linguistic change, which is not something I know much about. But like, if you think about language acquisition as the kid having to reinvent the entirety of the language in their own head, it's not surprising that it's a messy process. So you get these gradual changes that will spread across time, and that's how you start with Latin and end up with Italian. But that's I think it then puts a lot of things that would otherwise be more surprising than they should be. Like it iLanguage makes that very natural.
Mm.
So these discussions that philosophers have about like partial and erroneous grasps of the language, or like how do you handle disagreement and this sort of thing, like who really knows the meaning, who gets to say that, you don't need to worry. um, yeah.
Okay, good. That's a good way of thinking about it for me. Um, I guess talking about I had it in our notes to talk a little bit about like how iLanguage as a sort of paradigm, or call it like a research project, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
arose, and why it matters. And we've covered like what it is, and I think a bit about how it arose, but maybe we could put a little bit more of a point on it. I mean, so as far as I understand things, I think about it in terms of David Lewis has got this essay that you're familiar with. Some people might be. It's really popular. It's called Languages and Language, where he talks about like language as a thing that people do, but also as a um, like a social phenomenon used for solving what he calls like coordination problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of what Chomsky's doing with the IE thing is just saying that like what Lewis is talking about with like the sociality, that's E language, it's external and it's fine, you can do it, but that's not what like linguists, in terms of how he
Mm-hmm.
talks about it, are interested in. Because as we talked a little bit about before, it's just, for one thing, it's too broadly defined to be something you could study scientifically. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess maybe one response to this would just be to say, well, so what? Linguistics doesn't have to be a science. And maybe some people have taken that track. I'm not entirely sure. But I know the IE language thing for Chomsky comes a little bit later. That it postdates the his book Aspects, right? Or at least
Yeah,
postdates an
much.
earlier publication of it. Um, so on top of like all this other theorizing he does about like competence and performance, I mean, we talked about how those are different, but um, why do you think what's your take on why the I language formulation of this idea like specifically kind of had to come about? I mean, as you say, it solves these problems. It gets you at least out of sort of endless debates, which is always good. But it also seems like natural, like right, like it seems like pretty like a pretty natural follow through of something like the poverty the stimulus argument.
Yeah.
And I know we talked about this already a little as well. Like part of what it does is get you out of these criticisms of like,
Hmm.
well, when you're talking about you can't idealize like language because language is messy. And of course,
Yeah.
idealizing it and then treating it as a kind of like target of science are different. But um, yeah, I guess that's part of the question is like, why did this come about later? And like, what did it arise in response to specifically?
So I think there's if you start with syntactic structures, which was not the first thing Chomsky wrote, but it was the first thing that was widely circulated. Um, these were these short, like, well, they were intended as lecture notes, but they were, really where generative linguistics like started. There's a very influential analysis of like English verb inflection that was like, you know, inspired a whole few generation of linguists, and for those of us lucky enough to have been taught it, again, inspired us too. But that book has very little discussion of psychology, and it has little to no discussion, I think, no discussion of language acquisition. Aspects brings in the problem of the kid learning the language, and as time goes on, that just takes more and more place, sort of more and more of a central place, and it becomes clear that like, look, we're doing psychology, um, we're studying something that's mentally represented, and Chomsky being the kind of what's the word, being someone who's aiming for like a real natural science wants ultimately unification with biology, right? That this we want to be able to talk about the stuff the brain is doing. Um, there is no alternative, I think, to the I language perspective on that issue. So I mean, just the kind of trivial reasons that brains are into, that they're trapped in people's heads. Um, like for him, linguistics really has to be if it's going to be unified with biology, it really has to be the kind of thing you could do with a brain in a vat. Um, Whether that's, people then like to put pressure on this, sometimes mention population biology and things like that. I don't know how those charges sort of stick, but the point, I think, by the time you get to 1986, which is when the I language, E language distinction is made, um, though I do think it's implicit in earlier work, but the point there is really, look, if we're aiming for a science of like the mind brain, um, then you just have to tell me like there's a fact of the matter about the computation the brain is carrying out, and it's done in an individual's head. Um, and like, you know, I well, that gets you the individual, internal, and intentional. Like, I think it's the taking very seriously linguistics as a cognitive science that made I language sort of come about. Um,
But yeah, for those who
yeah,
are not aware of this history, anybody listening who isn't, I mean, Chomsky is like one of the what six like founding fathers basically of cognitive science as a discipline, and this goes right along with it, right? Like this study of language. Yes, it's also come to be called, was it biolinguistics, the term for
yeah.
or is that, I guess it's probably a more narrow term than like this research project, but
I think it came a little bit later, and I personally I never felt that that's clearly defined enough to like say that you're doing biolinguistics as opposed to just doing regular linguistics. Um, but if you care about language acquisition, if you care about language processing, doing behavioral experiments, doing neurological experiments to find out how language is mentally represented, I think all of that counts as biolinguistics. But like I said, it's just not a label I personally have felt
yeah.
clarifies anything.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, as far as I've understood it, it's sort of just like getting at the idea like that there's some sort of like biological or well, biological and psychological reality where they're taken to be the same thing of like
yeah,
linguistic phenomena, or at least like the phenomena that gives rise to linguistic behavior. There's like some sort of psychological and therefore biological reality to it. But yeah, not to be
right.
confused with biosemantics. That's Ruth
Uh,
Millikan. That's a different thing.
yeah.
But I see how that could be confusing. Yeah. So I mean, I had some questions too about like applications as well as implications of I language, like in
Mhm.
experiments and specific research projects. But I guess since we're talking about like I language being this like pretty reigning paradigm in syntax, it's worth asking about like part of the reason it arose is like taking cognitive science more seriously or taking linguistics more seriously as
Mhm.
an aspect or a form of cognitive science. Um, so, getting clear on like this question of how do you have a research paradigm or research program in linguistics
Yeah.
and I language is like, well, here's how this is kind of some of the parameters. Um, so what are, I guess, for example, some of the research questions that you get out of this I language view once you have it? Like I mean, obviously there's what we've talked about, right? Like once you do have this view, it does kind of settle you into this framework a little bit of like, well, there's going to be some biological reality. There's going to be a grammar, probably and possibly some sort of universal one that underlies speaker hearer competence. And then that's going to
Mhm.
have relations you can discover or discover things about or discover negations about via like data about performance, right? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, what are some of the more like specific research questions? And I mean, if you want to self-promote here, go for it. But but even if
Yeah.
you want to speak more generally, I guess, because I guess that's one thing I'm not clear on, just because I'm not in this like research as much as you are. Like what are
Yeah.
people who are into this I language stuff really interested in doing at a more specific
Um,
level?
so I think here's a nice illustration that I'm not going to self-promote, but this is work my one of my advisors did with other people. So there's a paper, Han, Lids, and Mussolino from 2007, um, uh, where they were looking at Korean. Um, there are two ways a verb. So syntacticians typically assume that tense sits high in the tree and the verb sits low in the tree. And there's two ways a tense ending can get onto its verb. Either the verb climbs up and meets the tense, or the tense comes down to meet the verb. And language is divided to which one they are. So English is uh, tense lowering, and French is verb raising. And you can see that because of the difference in adverb order. Like in French, you would say, uh, like, John plays often football, but in English, you'd say John often plays football. Um, so in French, it seems like the verb's sort of gone further away from the object, hence it's climbed up. Um, Korean, however, has the verb at the end. So it would be a subject object verb language. So it's John football plays. There is then no evidence in the kid's input to tell you whether it's verb raising or tense lowering. Adverb order is always going to be something like subject, adverb, object, verb. So in English, I can know it's verb, it's tense lowering because the verb follows the adverb. In French, I know it's verb raising because the verb precedes the adverb. Korean, there's no way of knowing. So, that question was like, well, which is it? And they have this cool data that, so you get like, there are some words that have to occur within the scope of negation. So these are words like ever in English. Like, um, you can't say something like, I ever eat chicken. It has to be I don't ever eat chicken. Like no matter what, there has to be a negation in the sentence. These negative polarity items have to have a negation in them. So they wanted, and in Korean, negation sort of gloms onto the verb. So if the verb is gonna get higher, it's gonna take negation with it. But if tense comes down, negation is gonna stay low. So if you have an object sort of in the middle of, if you have the verb here and tense here, and the object somewhere here, if the object is one of these things that has to be below a negation, If the verb goes up, the object should be fine because the negation that's glommed onto the verb, that'll be higher than it. If the tense comes down to the verb, the object, should be ungrammatical there because it's not within the scope of negation. And what they found was even within families, like people were consistent about their judgments within themselves, but it was random which would they be. So you couldn't tell about a person which one they'd be, like whether they thought Korean was verb raising or tense lowering. But but they were completely consistent within themselves. So like they'd always say, yeah, that object is bad there. Now that is kind of that. Well, firstly, I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But uh, the interesting thing there is like there's a huge amount of individual variation in language. It's subtle. You have to really work to find it, and you have to think about what the predictions are and how to test them. Like, but the interesting thing there was just like even within families, like siblings would vary about whether they found a negative polarity item in the middle there, whether they found that good or bad. And it's purely, well, their analysis of this was maybe right, maybe wrong. But their analysis of this was, well, people are basically, because the data they're receiving during language acquisition doesn't disambiguate between the verb raising hypothesis and the tense lowering hypothesis, they have to pick at random. Um, Now that in the I language perspective, like we don't have to ask sort of nonsense questions about like, well, which one is Korean? uh, you get half the grammars like distributing one way and half the grammars distributing another way, purely because the input during language acquisition doesn't tell you which like what the rule is. It couldn't tell you what the rule is, in fact. Um, so that I think that's the kind of question I think the I language perspective can make very clear, studying individual variation. I don't think that's the only thing that it can make clear, but I think that's a striking demonstration of its benefits. Um, like you start to think about, look, everyone could vary. Everyone has to face the language acquisition problem from scratch pretty much, except for UG. So, what are they doing? How is it that the linguistic input and UG are getting put together in their grammar? How could it be different from others? Why must it be the same? If it turns out to be the same, why must it be the same? Um, if the Korean data, well, suppose we look at Korean and then you look at another language that's sort of relevantly similar in not telling you whether it's tense lowering or verb raising, and you get everyone patterning the same way, that they all find it bad or they all find it good, then there's something interestingly different about that language from Korean. There must be something different in the input. Um, and you could that becomes a research question. So like, like I said, the I language thing breaks out into two things: universal grammar, what everyone has in common, and the linguistic input, what's different for everybody. Um, and that, both of those are like very significant um, research areas.
Cool. I mean, yeah, yeah. Sorry, did I cut you off from something?
No, 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 not
You're good.
really.
Okay, good, good. That's cool. It's good to hear about like, research you're connected with, very contemporary stuff. I guess, yeah, that's this is a basic point kind of coming out of that we said about like I language having this real advantage in terms of explaining or researching, say, like individual variation because well, it makes sense in all these kinds of contexts. Um, Here's a basic and broad question that I can specify if I need to, but what is the I language perspective on like linguistic convergence then? Because it, yeah, clearly it'd be very straightforward. Like everybody has their own like set of internal representations of, rules that they're getting from input or whatever, put it kind of very simply. Um,
Yeah.
and it is sort of vague in some ways. Like to talk about like a language like English because as people have
Mm-hmm.
pointed out, it's like well the English of like the Bronx versus the English of like, Appalachia is going to be, different,
Mhm.
right? So yeah, what is the perspective then on like what do you say about when languages converge? Is it because there's this condition of like mutual intelligibility that no one's happy with anymore because you can kind of set up all these like sort of gradient experiments to like as counter examples. Um, Sorry, this is a broad question again of like, well, what's the iLanguage perspective on linguistic convergence? But I think it might help make some things clear, at least for me. Like the variation stuff I have down, but like, what do you say about when languages converge? Both, I guess, as a research and theoretical question.
So I think, I mean, in a sense, this is like the fundamental question behind um, linguistics. Like why, oh, UG is like, why do languages vary but less than they could have? Um, I take it by convergence, you mean something like that. Like what, how come the languages end up being so similar sometimes?
Yeah.
Um, I think it's particularly striking when you get languages that have nothing to do with each other, uh, like being similar. So um, there's this joke between people who study Mayan languages and Austronesian languages spoken in like Southeast Asia. Um, like they turn out to be surprisingly similar for no known reason. It's not like they were historically connected or something. So it's not like Appalachian and Bronx English where you can at least say like, well, ultimately they came from the same like pilgrims or something. Um, so there's this joke of like the sometimes people like the Pacific Sprachbund, like that language family that just extends across the Pacific, the entire ocean, like Central America and Southeast Asia. Um, but the reasons, like, so suppose I were researching that question. I know people who are, but I don't happen to be. The way a syntactician often starts to think about it is like, well, that has to follow from something deep. So what properties of the grammars are the same? Suppose they have a lot of verb initial languages, for example. Um, well, is something like that, is there one thing that's actually controlling a lot of this variation? So um, so I think syntax is like at its best when it's doing one of two things, where either it looks at things that are superficially very similar and then tries to find out like are they actually under the hood, are they actually quite different? um so this would be something like the difference between raising verbs and control verbs. Like if you have something like John seems to be a genius and John wants to be a genius, they like their surface look is very similar, but in fact they end up being quite different in that like you can say stuff like it seems John is a genius, but you can't say it wants that John is a genius. um like syntacticians are great at going off and doing that, like, oh, you thought these things were the same, but like actually here are these differences. And then there's the other side of the coin, which I think is what this question is about, is like where you look at two things that look very different and say actually the difference between these two things reduces to another difference sort of more clearly definable in the grammar, that the identifiable in the grammar. So the kid doesn't actually have to learn those differences in particular because they saw this more obvious difference. This one kind of follows from that. I can't, just give an example off the top of my head for this one, unfortunately. But like usually when it comes to linguistic convergence, the way UGites sort of want to think about that is not just like you don't want to just brute force say, oh, well, language is either like they're either like this or they're like that. Um, the you want to say, well, this language is like this because it has this extra like doohickey that does something special, and from that a range of differences follow. Um, so when there's convergence, it's because there's kind of this one small tweak at a higher level that then kind of percolates through the rest of the grammar. Uh, one example that people sometimes held up that I don't think, in the face of more evidence, I don't think this one has really stood the test of time. But when it came to the subject drop languages, the ones I mentioned earlier, like Italian, usually they have richer agreement. English, verb endings don't change very much. Like, I go, you go, he goes, we go. But Italian will have a bunch of different endings for them. And because you have so much information about the subject on the ending, you can get rid of it. Like, oh, you have the, you ending, so of course the subject was you. Um, but then, that's kind of the thing people want to say. Like, you don't just want to say the kid has to just learn is it a subject drop language or not. They can do things like, well, rich agreement correlates with subject drop. Um, Again, I don't think that one's true. Don't I don't endorse that view of subject drop, but like, um, but that I think that's kind of the way people tackle convergence. That there's something about the architecture of the grammar that forces you into um, the grammar couldn't have looked different in some way.
Okay, cool. By the way, sorry, can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I had a little bit of technical difficulty with my earbuds dying while you were answering that, so I luckily didn't miss too much of anything. So we're back. Okay, good. So we've gone over variation, convergence. I mean, hey, it explains everything. Um, I'm sure there's more we can talk about, and I'll ask you probably some more questions. But one thing that's hesitant to ask about because it's just almost too topical to be interesting is large language models, it's AI
Uh,
stuff. And I partially ask about it because you had a really good blog post about it I read, I think, about close to a year ago on why like this sort of, I guess to give people some background, there was like an influx of internet posts from people when the ChatGPT stuff kind of hit the mainstream. That was kind of like announcing the death of Chomsky and linguistics, and you had this really good post about why like syntacticians don't actually practicing linguists don't really care about this, but I guess it fits in the context of like I language having this perspective and then contemporary research. Um, so yeah, why is it not true that large language models serve as a counterexample to this, Chomsky's
yeah.
work on generative
So,
grammar?
um, so take seriously again the notion of procedure, right? Like, there's a particular procedure we have for pairing sounds and meanings, and we want to find out what that procedure is. Suppose you manage to come up with a machine that for um, every sentence it told you perfectly what its meaning was. Even then, a syntactician would be within their rights to go like, great, is it doing what a person is doing? Um, like, cool toy, is it doing what a person's doing? We want to know what it is that human beings are doing. Um, it would be interesting if you could come up with a machine that way. Maybe it would even be illuminating to the human problem. But with ChatGPT, usually when you ask them, like people who work on this stuff, like, okay, well, can you tell me something about like its notions of meaning? You get a lot on word meaning. Like there's a lot of like hoo-ha about like, wow, the same vector will get you from like Japanese to sushi and German to like sauerkraut or something. Um, like that's interesting. I mean, that is interesting. I'll grant them that. But the kinds of things we usually care about are like scope ambiguities. Like, tell me why the man called the politician from Texas has two meanings and not three or one. I want a procedure that tells me that, and it has to be the right two meanings. It can't be like the man from Texas called the politician. That like that's just the name of the game, right? Take a sound, give me its possible meanings. Um, or like have this meaning, what's a good way of expressing that? Like just take a sound meaning pair and tell me, is that a part of the language or not? I don't think that's the question like LLM researchers are asking. That to me is the question I'm asking as a syntactician, like what is the procedure that lets me do that? So even if you had a procedure for doing that, which is not what they're trying to do, one would say, well, is that the right procedure? Um, but it's not even what they're trying to do in the first place. So, uh, it's cool. It is cool that you can type in like, give me a Shakespearean sonnet about like dog skateboarding, and it'll write a Shakespearean sonnet about dog skateboarding. That's neat. But but I don't know why it matters for psychology. The one thing that people have raised is kind of, well, Chomsky said in principle, language acquisition like this is impossible. I'm not sure if that is really what he said. And I'm not sure if like this research has shown that it is possible. But if anything, like if there's any relevance, it's that. What they don't have though is a competitor to a theory of syntax. Because the theory of syntax is, going to tell you things like John asked Bill to take a photograph of himself. The photograph is of Bill, and in the sentence John asked Bill to take a photograph of him. The photograph isn't of Bill. Like that's just the judgment most English speakers get. Like a lot of people get that judgment, not everyone, but like a lot. You come up with rules for that in syntax. We call it the binding theory that explains the distribution of pronouns and reflexive pronouns and things. But there's just no like competing explanation, right? Like that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, why is that meaning only possible with this sentence? Like why can the photograph of Bill be of Bill only when it's himself? Like that's a question we can try and answer. LLM folks it's like, I don't know if they can formulate the question in that framework, but like it's certainly not something they've even tried, I think. Like it's these why questions where you want to try and come up with a rule that explains that. The other thing is like the kind of sentence I mentioned earlier about what's bad. Um, who did John wonder whether Bill likes? A bad sentence. Syntacticians will come up with other stuff, and try and sort of group the explanation of other stuff being bad with that explanation. So like in English, you get these constructions like the difference between John is easy to please and John is eager to please. This is a famous pair from Chomsky. But that first one, John is easy to please, there's evidence that there's like a silent WH word that sort of moves in that sentence. So it's like John is like who easy to please, and that who means John. The evidence for that I won't get into, but like it exists. You have evidence for silent WH words in comparative constructions, like John is taller than Bill is. Like there's a silent WH word. I mean, some dialects of English have it pronounced like John is taller than what Bill is. But even in like my dialect, it's just there but silent. And that explains why sentences like John is taller than Al wondered whether Bill is, why that's bad, but why John is taller than Al said that Bill is good. That's a lot to say, sorry. But the point is you get all of these various things that again look different, but this is when one of those things where syntax is at its best. And you say, no, these things are all the same. They all have a silent WH word that moves. And so a lot of the insights of linguistic theory come from looking at these disparate constructions and then trying to find out like, oh, really under the hood, they're the same. LLM research, I mean, I don't know if like it could do that, but it's the kind of question that syntacticians ask that doesn't really even get asked. Like, it's part of the insight of syntactic theory to have grouped those constructions together. Um, and that I think is missing from a lot of language modeling research. That like you want to say the reasons these constructions behave the way they do is because underlyingly they're similar. Um, and unless you have a notion of underlying structure, that's extremely difficult to state. Um, like it's impossible to state if all you have is next word prediction, basically. And I know the current models are more sophisticated than that, but like, yeah, you get the picture.
Yeah. Good, thanks. So I'll try to remember to link that post as well as like other of your stuff. But yeah, that's great. I mean, I agree that it's not even clear to me that Chomsky ever claimed that that sort of system was like in principle impossible. His claim always seemed to me to be like more or less an a posteriori one about how humans operate and the simple fact that human infants don't get nearly enough stimulus to go on to produce and understand infinite grammatical utterances. And then the counterexample is supposed to be, well, look at this machine that we fed billions of
Yeah.
examples of utterances. It's like, I don't know. I don't think
I
that's the
will
same.
just flag there's some interesting research. I think they call it like baby LM or something. Like they're trying to find out whether, if you fed it just child directed, we have these extensive corpora of child directed speech. What could a language model do with that? And, so trying to tackle that question of like, what could you do if all you had was the linguistic input a kid gets? Um, it's tricky, obviously, because kids also have like social cues and like,
Yeah.
um, the whole looming buzzing uh, input like that, and the LLM doesn't. But yeah,
Good, good. Well, thanks. I mean, hey, sorry to ask about the AI stuff. I know it's, but gotta give the people what they want to some extent. Um, okay, I think we covered a lot of the main bullet points I had to talk about iLanguage. So if you want, I'm good to move on to philosophy, but is there anything I missed asking about we should cover with
um, no,
basics
I
of
think that's
iLanguage?
good. That's sort of what, yeah, it's the picture of what linguists are up to.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so this is a little bit more in my wheelhouse now. See how we're doing on time. We're doing all right, I think. So talk a little bit about like philosophical issues that
Mhm.
arise with this kind of thing, but also like implications this may or may not have for um, philosophical debates. I mean, namely, we're going to talk about semantic internalism versus externalism. So I'll say a little bit about what that is in a second, but um, also, mental representations or notoriously philosophically interesting. I won't say problematic. They're at least interesting. I don't find them problematic. Some people do. They're undisputably interesting. And then controversial Fodor's language of thought hypothesis. That are also interesting connections to like his modularity thesis, like whether or not maybe like the language faculty is a module in the same way like modules for the senses are. Um, Chomsky thinks something like that, right? He thinks that like there's at least an analogous relation between like say the like visual processing system and like the language processing system, right?
Yeah, modularity is one of those terms that I feel like I think it's used in two different senses. So Fodor points this out, at least in The Mind Doesn't Work That Way, his reply to Pinker's, How the Mind Works. Um, but Chomsky's notion of a module is something like a database. So there's a linguistic module in that there's a repository of information in your head and my head specific to linguistics, not linguistics, but specific to language. Um, so that it's something in memory that's sort of kept apart, your mental dictionary or like rules of syntax, your phonology, all of that. And that's not just in like generalized, like everything happens. And then there's this other notion of modularity that comes up within linguistics, like extremely specifically, which is the kind of thing I mentioned earlier, that the rules of syntax don't make reference to semantics or phonology. So, or vice versa. Like you get you get rules in syntax like move the highest NP, noun phrase. You don't get rules like move something that starts with an S or move something that's like I don't know, like denotes denotes a person. You don't get that kind of rule. You just get rules like move noun phrase, um, move question word. So the rules of syntax are defined without reference to semantics or phonology. So it's kind of like the rules of syntax, they have blinkers on them. They can't see the semantic properties or the phonological properties of the expression they're manipulating. That is another notion of modularity. And then there's Fodor's notion of modularity, which is completely different to all of those. I think he had in mind properties of performance systems, basically, like the it's information that's encapsulated. Like I can see the Muller-Lyer illusion where there's one line, there's two lines that are the same length, but like one has arrows facing like that and the other has arrows facing like that, and one will look longer than the other, even when I know it's an illusion. Like even when I know that they're the same length, the perception doesn't change. So the visual system is operating on like a limited um, amount of information. That's Fodor's notion of like that's the kind of core essence of his notion of a module. Though he has these like 9 criteria, I think, like they're fast, they're automatic, neurally somewhat localizable, um, they don't talk to each other, they're not accessible to consciousness, so on. Like Oh, and the other important thing to stress is like for him, that they're very gradient notions. He keeps stressing that his notion of modularity is something that admits of less and more. Um, and of course, for him, a large chunk of the mind, the central systems are non-modular, where you get like holistic reasoning about, belief fixation and whatnot. That for him, he's insistent is non-modular because they're sensitive to a huge amount of information. Um, so those two notions of modularity, like the database idea and the like small automatic machine kind of idea, very different. But they're often glommed together. Like that distinction is sort of run all over. Um, I happen to think for linguistic, for language processing, modularity in both senses is kind of like well motivated, but like, um, but we can get to this. There's another component of the question that I'm now forgetting.
Oh, yeah, so I was kind of just going over. Oh, I was just asking, yeah, if yeah, it was a question about, oh yeah, whether or not like Chomsky, he just makes these analogous points sometimes between like the language faculty, like what he calls the language faculty, and then like how speech is processed in the brain.
Mhm.
I don't know, I guess if he thinks that they're like actually analogous in this modular sense, or if he's just kind of using them as like biological analogs. So it may not be super important, but um, yeah, which was kind of, I guess, the question you sort of ended up answering with the modularity stuff, because what he doesn't think they're modules in like quite the same way that Fodor thinks like there's a module for like sight.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know if he deny the modularity claim
right.
that Fodor makes, but it's just not the claim that he happened to be making, in the 80s. But yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
No. Yeah, just a it's a flag one issue here that we can maybe come back to, but I guess we can move on to philosophy for the sake of time. But there's this sort of just talking about modularity reminded me, sort of Pinker and Fodor reminded me of evolutionary psychology and this idea of
Mm-hmm.
modules as adaptations. And one thing Chomsky talked about in the interview that you had with him for the Oxford Linguistic Society, he talked a bit about this, like, I guess you'd call it like a evolutionary puzzle of like, well, whatever the core language faculty is, it has to be like complex enough to produce all like this infinite set of sentences, but it also has to be simple enough to have evolved like really quickly, given like some of the data we're getting about. I guess if people want more empirical work on that, I think it was Terence Deacon has like work on like called a book called The Symbolic Species. That's more about
Yeah.
like the evolutionary side of things. But
Mm.
I don't know if I did want to ask you what you thought about that. Like if it worries any I language theorists, like this sort of like seeming incongruence. Like it didn't seem to worry Chomsky when he talked about it because he seemed to think that like there's fairly good evidence that it was simple enough to have evolved quickly and yet be complex enough to produce language. Um, But this, I mean, I'm interested in this, so I
Yeah.
was just curious. Do you have any thoughts on it, or is it something syntacticians are worried about at all? Like, is it a puzzle, or is it kind of just a side issue?
I mean, yeah, this is like one of the big thrusts behind uh, linguistic minimalism, which is sort of one of the big ideas in linguistics. Um, but the just about the Deacon book, David Purple, who's a neurolinguist, has um, a pretty blistering review of that, where I think he rightly points out, like, this is a book about everything, and I'm suspicious about books about everything.
Yeah.
um, and I think that's right. Like, we don't have a clear enough idea about what the basics are. What minimalism has been trying to do, so this is an idea, Chomsky was pushing sort of in the mid 90s onwards, and it's kind of become one of the big players, um, is that, like, look, what if syntax were as simple as possible? What if syntax was just uh, binary set formation, like you just take two things and glom them together, uh, plus whatever conditions the language external systems force on that. So, meaning, like, whatever our conceptual systems are and so on, what are the conditions they force on language, and like our motor systems for speech and perception and so on, what are the conditions they'll force on language? So, like, suppose, think about the question this way: why does a bird not have language? Like, a bird can produce all sorts of interesting structured sounds in birdsong, and it has thoughts. We know birds have, like, cognition, and they do, reasoning and whatnot. Why can't they put them together? Um, and Chomsky's saying, well, what they're missing is, like, syntax. What they're missing is a procedure to pair the sounds and meanings. But what if the procedure was just like, take two atoms, like words or whatever it is, stick them together, and just keep doing that. Like, stick these two things together. Now stick the thing you made into another thing. Um, and that idea that structure building happens that way has itself led to a lot of insights. Um, but then the idea was like, well, this structure building operation is also going to be constrained by the two things it's trying to, um, like, link up the sounds and the meanings, those independent systems. Whether we've come any closer to actually answering the evolutionary question, like, the idea was, oh, look, this, like, super simple thing of, like, take two things, put them together, plus linking these guys up, that's going to get you all of language. Um, it's certainly led to some insights. We've managed to eliminate some things. Like, previously the grammar was very complicated. You'd have these very elaborate rules, and now, like, this minimalist idea has led people to look for explanations elsewhere. Like, you look for explanations in terms of the interfaces. Like, for example, why does language have linear order at all? Like, why, uh, well, it might be that there's a property of the production system that forces that, and you think about what that might be. Whether those answers are right, these why questions, they're really difficult to answer. Um, and in terms of the evolvability, who knows? At least, like, working syntacticians were worried about questions like, what's up with question formation in Hindi? Um, Not like, how did we get here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Like, um, I'm glad there are people working on it, but I myself am not in a position to like really investigate. Where there is super cool insight is a lot of mathematical linguistics, where they'll say, like, look, if you have this kind of rule in your grammar, like a rule that allows you to say copy stuff, like, honest to God, copy stuff. Take a noun and copy it to this place. it actually turns out to be very complicated. And the grammar that like the machine you would need to generate that kind of language that allows you to copy stuff would be as powerful as a Turing machine. And syntacticians hate that. We don't like doing, what we want is a principled explanation for like why is language complicated but not that complicated. Um, like in language, you get a lot of dependencies, like two things sort of dependent across two intervening things like this. What's what we thought never happened was like dependencies like this. Like you don't really get trees like that. It turns out, this was discovered like Swiss German and like Dutch and stuff has that, but not very much. So, they're like mildly context sensitive, it's called. But so to rule out stuff like these complicated dependencies across the board, we do want a simple computing device. Like we don't want a Turing machine underwriting the grammar. You want like a context-free grammar or a mildly context-sensitive grammar, which simply cannot generate certain kinds of dependencies. It's like too dumb a machine. Um, so the notion of simplicity and like paring the grammar down, I think super important and probably helpful um, in answering that question about like the like where it all came from. But like if you're just working on like pronoun co-reference in Greek, like it doesn't really come up like just in practice. And so I think there's like a real argument to be made that like letting yourself be bogged down too much by the evolutionary questions can sometimes be like an unwelcome distraction that's like getting in the way of just doing good linguistic work. But I'm kind of a curmudgeon like that.
Yeah, I can
Um,
see it being, yeah, more of a domain of like a certain kind of like anthropology, maybe, at least at this stage, because there's, or yeah, at least being separate at this stage, because like we probably need to know a little bit more about like what constraints there actually are on language before we know like how complex of a mechanism need to have
yeah,
evolved to produce it. So
yeah.
having things in their separate buckets for now is perfectly fine. Well, it's good to know that you're not kept up at night about the this evolutionary puzzle when you're working on what you're working on. But sorry, that was a sidetrack question from talking about some of this semantic stuff, but it was something I
Mhm,
forgot to ask about earlier. Um, yeah, in the interest of time, I guess we'll go right into like internalism, externalism, and then
mhm,
if we have time after that, maybe a little bit about the language of thought hypothesis. But I guess broadly speaking, I wanted to ask you what you think about what implications this I language stuff or this I language sort of program has on these debates over internalism, externalism. And I prefaced it a little bit earlier when I asked about, you know, like the domains of syntax and semantics and their relation
yeah,
in general, but more specifically, whether or not, I language commits you to certain views on these things. So for people to give a brief overview of semantic internalism, externalism, it's a divergence of views on meaning of words, and then it gets into like meaning of thoughts as well. But I guess even just to focus on like word meaning, uh, there's this question of like, well, is our meanings completely internal, like to the heads of speakers, understanders, whatever, or is there external elements like are meanings in some sense dependent on and or constituent of like the external world? And I mean the dependence constituents thing is a real difference, but we won't like get into that, I guess. Classic externalist examples and such as twin earth or Burgess arthritis argument, which we can talk about, sometimes end with externalists claiming like, well, the upshot is that meaning isn't in the head. um and I mean, Chomsky has a funny interview at one point where it's like from years ago when someone asked him about that quote from Putnam, and he was like, well, it's incoherent.
yeah,
uh, and I mean, as Tyler Bird just pointed out, like it's not an essential feature of being an externalist that you think that. That's not, it just has to be that like
yeah.
the meaning of terms or thoughts has some relation to the external world. But I guess I can see someone thinking like, well, we're talking about I language where it's internal, it's intentional, so it's sort of like functional, it's internally mentally represented, and it's totally individual. So then if that's true of this sort of system that produces language, does that mean that like the meanings of terms and also as a follow through, the meanings of thoughts are entirely in the heads of speakers? I mean, you mentioned it earlier, like Chomsky wants it to be the case that we could do linguistics for a brain in a vat. And that's sort of like anathema to being an externalist, right? Is like, well,
Yeah,
no, the brain in the vat is, it has to be like hooked up. Basic one way of putting it is, brains have to be hooked up to the world in the right kind of way for their terms
yeah,
to mean the same thing. So, I mean, I want to give you a chance to answer all this flurry of questions, but just to set the stage a little bit on externalism, the twin Earth example being, imagine some distant planet in the same, like not a different possible world, but like actually at this moment out there, there's like a planet way far away, with a more or less like microphysical and behavioral duplicate of me. The only difference on this faraway planet, like there's a twin Micah and a twin Mal having this conversation. The only difference is on that planet, the stuff that we call water is not made of H2O, it's made of XYZ. So it's twin water. It's not the same chemical stuffs. And there's this question as well, do Micah and twin Micah have the same mental states? And in the classic Putnam paper, the classic one is the meaning of meaning. Earlier paper is the meaning of reference, I think. Um, and the answer Putnam gives is like, well, no. Twin Micah, when he says, I want a glass of water and drinks the thing and has all the same gustatory process and everything, um, he is not in the same state that Micah is in. Micah and twin Micah are in different states because, for one thing, we talk about water, even though we're using the same like word token, we're representing different things because representations represent the world as a certain way. Our worlds, environments in this case, are different. So when Micah says, I want a glass of water, and twin Micah says, I want a glass of water, he's actually talking about twin water. I'm actually talking about water. So
yeah,
because our environments differ, um, the contents of our terms differ, and thereby, because the contents of our, it gets a little bit complicated how it relates to thought, but the basic idea being, well, if the contents of your terms differ, then the objects of your beliefs differ. And if the objects of your belief differ, it's not too far of a jump to get to like actual mental states that constitute beliefs being different.
yeah.
That stuff's a little more technical. That's just to set the stage on like what an externalist says. Like if there's different stuff in your environment and you're referring to like a different physical object, in this case, a natural kind term, your words don't mean the same thing. So to bring it back to I language, does I language view have to deny something like semantic externalism, or can you marry them? And I guess that's the basic question, but then maybe more broadly, like how do you see this relation?
Um, so I mean, in terms of like, can you marry them? People have certainly attempted to. So Peter Ludlow, for example, has attempts of talking about a referential semantics for I languages. Um, where where I do think there's a tension between um, the two claims. Here's I think um, I think here's like the kind of issue that's at hand. Meaning is not a technical term. Um, we have all sorts of like feelings about meaning. Meaning can mean all sorts of things. Like what does this poem mean to you? Like I'm just I'm gonna go like Oxford Ordinary Language philosopher for a moment and just like you can talk
Yes.
about the meaning of a sentence. Like you can talk about the meaning of a poem. You can talk about like the meaning of a weird look. You can talk about you know like what did you mean? What did you mean by that? Like um, you know all people mean things by their actions. Um, stop signs mean things. Like there's all sorts of things there. There's the technical notion reference, which was introduced for like you know um, formal languages and things. Like when Frege, so Frege in the essay like the thought, which is really like it's genuinely like chock full of like deep insights about language. But like um one of the things he's talking about is like assertion, the act of assertion. That's one of the things we can do with sentences. Crucially, it's not like it's a thing we do with sentences. So when twin Micah asserts something, it might be that he asserts something different to what you assert when you say, like, I want a glass of water. That's something that we can and should think about as philosophers of language. What's different is linguistic semantics. Um, they're related questions, but like linguistic semantics is here's one way of thinking about it. Syntax is what pairs semantics and phonology. Therefore, as a semanticist, here's what I study. I study the things syntax pairs with phonology. So whatever I say is like going to be deeply constrained by the syntax, right? Here, like all I can say is there's a system that reads the output of the syntax. What are the properties of that system? Here is where the kinds of examples Chomsky brings up kind of become very interesting. So these are like the bank moved across the street after it burnt down, where the bank and it can co-refer, but like if it burnt down and moved across this, like if it moved across the street and maintained identity, it's an abstract object. If it can burn down, it's a physical object. So now you have this like weird chimerical object that's like both, physical and abstract. Um, that's kind of interesting. Like if you just take the syntax seriously, and then like, so this is all within the general problem of polysemy. And Jeff Nunberg has a lot of like classic essays about this, where at some point he says like, look, polysemy is like it's always been there. It's what the syntax has been trying to tell us all along, but we've never like noticed. Where you can say stuff like the ham sandwich is at table 4, like, and to mean like the guy who ordered the ham sandwich. Um, so that's all of that is super interesting, and once you let the grammar constrain your hypotheses about meaning, I think you're just like naturally pulled to ask a very different question to like, what are the kinds of assertions people make? What are the kinds of speech acts? Like there you're talking about something that's going on where like semantics meets pragmatics, where the sentence is used in very particular ways that systematic ways. There's insightful things to say about them. But suppose we just focus on the system that interprets the syntax. There, I think it looks like whatever information is in the syntax, like if you just think, that basic compositionality point of the meaning of a sentence is determined by the structure of the sentence and the meaning of its parts. It looks like the meaning of the parts and the structure of the sentence just isn't rich enough to determine, reference, like truth conditions. In a way, like the compositionality point is like exactly the right way to read Frege's observation about like attitude verbs and like the failure of substitutivity. Like you just need something that composes. Like, why is it if you're telling me the meaning of John is like, if you're telling me the meaning of the evening star is that thing, then why is it that like John believes the evening star is not the morning star? Like doesn't mean John believes that thing is not that thing. Like, you know, uh, you just need this other thing. Like, if you just take composing the meaning seriously, you're just naturally led to different conclusions. Um, to honest to God reference, like, I think this is the kind of thing Chomsky has in mind when he says like Chomsky's not he doesn't deny the existence of reference. He doesn't think like, oh no, there's no such thing as reference ever. He says stuff often like words don't refer to things, people refer to things. So the appropriate level of explanation of like truth conditions and assertion and content and so on is at the level of what people do with their sentences. It's at the level of the speech act in a particular context with world knowledge coming in and like, speakers' intentions, all of that. And if you like want to try and come up with a theory of that, like good luck, power to you. Um, but the linguistic semantics, the kind of thing that would study, say, polysemy, like entailment, etc., that seems like a lot more robust, a lot different to, you know, whatever's going on in like the like wild mess of like pragmatics. Like that's it's something a lot more narrow. So the way I read internalism is basically, well, it's basically that like if you just focus on the thing that interprets the syntax, what can you do? How much information is there? And it looks like it isn't rich enough to determine truth conditions. It's, just a mental representation. The arguments against it, such as they were like insistence about semantics meaning something different, like the word semantics. Like Lewis just has an assertion in his general semantics paper, I think, like semantics without truth conditions isn't semantics. Or what's like, okay, if that like the question is that an empirical claim or like a definition? Like if that's just how you're defining the word semantics, then like an internalist is happy to say like, okay, well then like by your count, I'm not doing semantics, but like I'm not gonna engage in a verbal dispute with you over this. Um, Even like the Evans and McDowell, their edited volume, Truth and Meaning, it's replying to these claims by like Fodor and Katz about semantic marqueries, where a sentence would be translated into a meta language, like the language of thought or whatever, where you say the meaning of this English sentence is this sentence in the language of thought. And they say, well, you haven't given me semantics. You've just like given me one syntactic representation and swapped it for another in a meta language. Um, but like, where's the semantics? Where's the representation world connection? And the internalist says like, well, I never promised you that. Um, so at least that's like the way I understand internalism, that it's trying to isolate um isolate the linguistic, well, the kind of I linguistic component to meaning, as in the thing where meaning is simply the thing the syntax pairs with the phonology. um whether like often semanticists will deny that there is such a level of representation. That's kind of where the interesting dispute is. But like they'll say, no, 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 you can get from the syntax to reference. So you get like, for example, in a lot of the semantic minimalists work, like Ernie Laporte, Emma Borg, so on, you get that kind of claim. And that is the radical claim, I think. Um, that's what the internalist would want to deny.
Okay. They'd want to deny the possibility of getting from syntax to reference.
Without any
If
kind of mediation. Yeah. So,
okay.
um, there's probably some like abstract level of representation, call it logical form, uh, like in the middle, that semanticists kind of study. Like logical form, I mean this with a small l and a small f. Like LF is a technical term in syntax that's different. But this would be the kind of thing where you do like event semantics, for example. So you want to explain inferences like if John boiled the water, then the water boiled. You could do that without appeal to reference. You could do that at this like intermediate level. Um, and often like semanticists will be interested in that sort of thing.
Interesting. Hmm. Think. I get, yeah, so in like the that's helpful because I had read that Chomsky is sometimes taken as like defending a version of um, P.F. Strawson's view and
Mm.
responding to Russell that like, well, words don't refer to things, people refer, and that tracks along with that. So I mean, in the twin Earth case, you know, there's nothing, at least on like the individualist or the I language view. There's nothing going on differently in terms of like processing, which I guess is kind of the same on the externalist view either way. But like they might be asserting something different in terms of being in different environments. But um, I don't. Do you think maybe this isn't an issue for syntacticians? Maybe it's a different question, like whether or not they're in different mental states. Like if your assertions differ, do
Oh,
your mental states differ? Like I don't know that it is the idea. Do you think
yeah.
this has any bearing on like the syntactical like I language stuff, or am I just asking philosophical questions because it's
Uh,
vaguely related?
I mean, I think it's an important and interesting question. I don't think it has any particular relation to the syntax,
Because
but
I
it
had
does have
asked,
an
sorry, because I when I had asked you this originally, I'd framed like, or maybe I didn't frame it quite well enough, but like part of the question I have about this is like, well, does having this I language view like commit you to giving a certain answer
mhm.
in cases like Twin Earth? Like, do you have to say that, well, no, Micah and Twin Micah are in the same
Yeah.
mental state?
So so I don't think iLanguage commits you to narrow content.
Good. Okay. Yeah.
Um, I don't think iLanguage commits you to the notion that there is something head internal that determines what content you have. iLanguage, as far as I understand it, is a claim about the syntax of mental representation. It is a claim that there are linguistic mental representations, that, there are linguistic computations that are defined purely as like, you know, manipulate these symbols. Like, I mean syntactic in a broad sense, not like
Yeah.
linguistic syntactic, but like, I mean, you get rules like you don't need to refer to like they're not defined by like relations to the world. So if we were doing I phonology, for example, we wouldn't need to talk about acoustics. We could just talk about like phonological symbols in the head, like my mental representation of a p, which might be different to someone else's mental representation of a p. That's an abstract symbol. Um, for an Arabic speaker, their mental representation of a p sound and a b sound would be the same symbol. Like we might as well write that symbol down as a smiley face, right? It doesn't matter like what it is. But the point is that symbol behaves a certain way. You can just define the rules with respect to that. You don't need to talk about what sounds it's referring to. Similarly, with semantics, I think it's the same. That like, look, you can define inferences. Like it's a proof theoretic way of thinking about semantics effectively. Like, um, I don't mean in the sort of Robert Brandom sense, but like you can do things like here's a really good inference: conjunction elimination, the scope of an existential quantifier. There's a thing that's P and Q, therefore there's a thing that's P. Um, like just by doing that, you can sort of start to, depending on the semantic representations you assign to sentences like John boiled the water, you can start validating inferences like John boiled the water, so the water boiled. Um, Purely proof theoretically. So you don't need to talk about what's referred to. Nor do you need to commit yourself to the claim that like the symbol for boil, for the like event predicate boil, determines what events you're going to think of as boilers. You might think of, to borrow an example from Paul Petrosky, like if you have like his example is chipmunks, it's Alvin and Theodora chasing each other around a tree. Like, is Theodore fleeing Alvin or is Alvin chasing Theodore? Like, those are going to be different event representations, and it might be that like they're going to be different logical forms, they're different symbols in the head. Do you need to say something like, well, no, but it's still important that the logical, like the symbol for fleeing and the symbol for chasing have a narrow content that will determine the events that you think of as fleeings and determine the events that you think of as chasings? Or can you talk about that in purely externalist? I suspect you could. I don't know what it adds to linguistic theory. I don't think it adds anything. In fact, like one wants to know what is the added benefit of talking about the contents. like I wanted to validate some inferences. I wanted to validated some inferences that like speakers intuitively think are good. I wanted to characterize their knowledge of the meanings of sentences. Do I need to talk about their relation to the world at all to do that? I mean, maybe like if I wanted to really have a theory about like what kinds of things people are disposed to call boilings and disposed to call fleeings and disposed to call chasings, like I could. But as far as I know, that kind of thing is like just not, it's not really on the table. Like this is where the kind of Fodorian point of like, here's what the meaning of kill is, kill. Here's what the meaning of die is, die. Here's what the meaning of like flee is, flee. Um, there's like nothing super deep to say about it. Like, um, we're not good at finding definitions. We are good at finding systematic inferences. Um, so it's kind of adding narrow content. I don't think is going to do any semanticists any good. So like we can just step away from that. We can if people wanted to have like there's syntax and there's like a purely externalist semantics to mental representations, I think they could. Um, iLanguage doesn't, you know, force you into any particular views of that. But yeah.
All right, good. That's good to hear because I'm like squarely an opponent of like strict narrow content views. So I'm like, that's good news for me. I can have both. Um, yeah, that was kind of one of the main questions I had in this section of like what one might wonder starting to read this stuff like I did, but the more philosophical bent. It's like, well, does this commit me to sort of like a radical internalism about meaning or
Mm,
content? And I guess the answer partially being like it doesn't really commit you to anything about content per se, and whether or not it commits you to anything about meaning depends on if you're like treating meaning as like sort of co-extensional with like I don't know a technical thing like reference or more of a I don't know more like speech acts or something. So
mm,
there's probably a lot more we could say about meaning. There always is. But in the interest of time, we probably shouldn't. And same with things like the Burge case. I mean, at least one more thing to address in the philosophy side, just because we both have an interest in it. I was reading um, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on philosophy of linguistics to kind of
mm,
get an overview of this and some of the competence, performance, and I language stuff. And in it, he references this paper from Quine that we both recently, well, reread in your case and read for me. Um, and he mentioned it it was cited when he mentioned, he's like, well, there's this dialect between Chomsky and Quine has this like famous influential argument against there being psychologically real generative grammars. And the argument is supposedly given in this paper, Linguistics and Philosophy from 1972, in a conference proceeding called Language and Philosophy, edited by Sidney Hook. So if anybody wants, there's the reference if anybody wants it. And it's this 3-page paper, and I tracked it down and
mm.
read it, and couldn't quite figure out what the argument was. So I was happy when you emailed me back, and also were a little bit puzzled. I mean, I to give my best shot at it, Quine in this paper, I wrote down something. He's talking about like whether he's responding to Chomsky's kind of charge that linguistics like vindicates rationalism in a way, but in doing so, he starts talking about like behaviorism and empiricism as opposed to Chomsky's view, and then observation sentences. So, and introspection. And he says things like, well, the introspection that Chomsky's talking about is fine, it's condonable, but it's only condonable insofar that it can be like couched in observation sentences. Or another way of putting it, that like the introspection itself is condonable insofar as it leads to conjectures that can then be like checked by or couched in observation terms. And when Quine here is talking about observation terms, he means things that can be like ostensively defined. So basically, he thinks you have to have like ostension to check introspection to get any sort of tract here. That was like the closest thing to like an argument I could pull out of the paper,
Mm.
but I think we were both a bit puzzled about this. So what was your take on this?
So, it actually turns out I read a different paper.
Oh, okay.
The paper I read was called methodological. Wait, what was it? Methodological remarks on like current linguistic theory or something like that. But the thrust of
Okay.
the paper is the same. It's a bit longer. But so the notion that there's such a thing as an observation sentence or like people assent to sentences and this and that's somehow behaviorally definable. Like it's the kind of point I was bringing up earlier. Like I need you to tell me what a noun is. I need you to tell me what like a phrase is. There's nothing in the signal that tells you about any of those things. Um, and we think people have intuitions about this, like cat is a noun and chair is a noun and so on. But like take a constituent, a phrase in syntax, we don't have intuitions about that. We have intuitions that count as evidence for a theorist who's trying to determine the constituent structure of a sentence, but we don't have like you can't walk up to like a guy on the street and be like, hey, like is this thing a constituent in your language? Which I'm not kidding is Quine's suggestion. He's like, look, your notions of like constituency and whatnot, like they would only make sense like if you like here's my simple suggestion, just like ask people like if you have a sentence like A, B, C, and there's two hypotheses, whether it's like A, B, and C or A and B, C, like just ask people. And like that's a situation that comes up in linguistic theorizing. So here's one like very famous kind of debate that happened was like in these accusative infinitive constructions, like John John believed her to be a genius. Fine sentence of English, but the question is like, is it John believed her to be a genius or John believed her to be a genius? Um, that second view was Chomsky's, and the first view was Postal. Um, but you can't just ask people, like, just try it. Like, what would it tell you? Um, People don't have judgments about like Jason Merchant, who's a syntactician, has a really nice analogy that I like to repeat often, which is syntax is like the study of black holes. You can't observe it directly. You have, you can study sound, you observe sound, and people have like clear intuitions about the meanings of sentences, but they don't have intuitions about syntax. Um, Syntax, you can only like really get to know what it is by like studying the intuitions about sounds and studying the intuitions about meanings and like seeing how they fit. Um, Trying to get them to do that. So um, I just don't know what Quine like had in mind with these kinds of suggestions, and I don't think like it's just this repeated insistence that like any doctrine that includes distinguishing extensional equivalence is the same. Here's I think an analogy that works for it certainly works on my undergrads who you know I I don't know if it would have worked on Quine, but so sorting algorithms, we understand a bunch of stuff about those. Like computer scientists know all sorts of things about sorting algorithms. This one takes like way longer than this one. Um, Same inputs, same outputs, right? They're all extensional equivalents, but like you can tell something um, about the algorithm's like timing properties. You can study that. Similarly, with linguistics, like when people are faced with linguistic tasks, they'll like slow down in certain ways, or like their eye movements will do things. This is like what experiments in linguistics are often about. And those will constrain hypotheses about the algorithms they're using. Um, like if that were the algorithm they used to compute the meaning of this sentence, like it would take way longer than it actually does. This kind of reasoning doesn't actually play out often, but like in principle, it would work. So the point is, there should be behavioral consequences um, of like linguistic computations happening in the brain. behavioral defined extremely broadly. Quine, for some reason, insists behavior includes things like assenting to a sentence. Um, and his way of, as Chomsky often points out, Quine's like strictures, like for some reason, he's just imposing these limits on linguistic theory. Um, you couldn't do something like, well, I don't know how it works in this, like the data in this language are super unclear, but every other language, like I've looked at Japanese, I've looked at Russian, I've looked at Greek. Here's how it works in those languages, and it seems to work the same in all languages, so it probably works the same in this one too. Like ordinary scientific reasoning, but Quine's kinds of like the rules he forces linguists to play by, they don't allow that kind of reasoning, but for no reason. Like it's it's just a kind of stipulation he's placing for just dogged like behaviorist reasons, just total skepticism about minds and minds and meanings. Like it that I think is I think in that paper, like it really would just convince the people who were already convinced like intentionality isn't real. You know, we can just do with um, well, okay, maybe the best way to say it is this way. Like, at least in the paper I read, he says something about like, look, what's a good representation of like a sentence like John felt? Like when we're doing logic, is it best to say like there's a predicate full and it applies to A, where A refers to John, like FA, or is it better to say like there's existential quantification, like there is someone who fell and that person was John, like um, you know, there is an X, X fell, and X equals A. Which one is better? And he says, well, depending on your purposes, one or the other is better. Cool. So depending on my purposes, when it comes to coming up with a grammar, even if there are extensional equivalents, here's a good reason for picking one grammar over the other. It would make sense of behavioral data under plausible linking assumptions. Like if my, I'm happy to concede to Quine, like you can pick extensional equivalents however you want. It just depends on what you want to do with them. Great, I will pick extensional equivalents however I want, but here's what I want to do with them. Try and come up with like a plausible sounding theory for like what kinds of computations human beings run in their brains. Um, I don't know. Like I feel like this is the kind of like being more pragmatist than Quine kind of response, but like I don't understand why the same pragmatism he offers like physicists and mathematicians doesn't apply to psychologists and linguists. Um, that's my retort. But
Excellent. Well, I'll have to read the paper that you read, so we're on exactly the same page. I mean, it's, but I mean, it sounds like, occasionally with Quine, once you have like kind of his take on a subject, you sort of have it across, multiple papers and whatnot. So we probably got at least vaguely some of the same information. Um, all right, good. That was a good retort as far as I understand it from the similar paper I read. Um, there's a lot more we didn't get to cover yet as far as like there's other twin earth examples. There's more about like the language of thought hypothesis, and then but I'm glad we covered. I'll probably won't go into all that because we're a little over 2 hours or a bit over two
yeah,
hours now. So I'll ask you a couple concluding questions. But it's good, I think, because usually with like the Chomsky and linguistic stuff, it's like really only the rationalism and empiricism gets covered under the philosophical issues. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about um, stuff that interests me, being self-serving. I was like, well, I like twin Earth experiments. We'll talk about externalism. I think you also suggested internalism, so it kind of worked out. I was like, well, we're both interested in
mm-hmm.
this. So, um, but as I mentioned before we recorded, I'd be happy to have you back to talk more philosophy, linguistics, and this is, um, I guess, a prelude to a future discussion that would be maybe be interesting. I asked you about this on Twitter once, but to ask it here, um, what advice would you give to philosophers of language as far as like
Oh.
making fewer mistakes or assumptions about linguistics or like what syntacticians work on, if any? You can decline to answer, but um,
I think I don't know if it's like Mistakes, uh, I would, I think familiarizing yourself with the methodology is probably the most important. Like people will get the rough idea of like, um, what, asking for judgments, especially in this kind of like, um, in the sort of American formalist tradition and philosophy of language, like Stalnaker and so on, like from the people who work on that sort of thing, like the conditionals industry. Um, you get a lot of judgment asking, and what you want to know, or like the practice, I think that syntacticians and semanticists and linguistics get that often philosophers of language don't, is actually like how to make a minimal pair. By a minimal pair, I mean like this would be okay. So suppose I'm testing for like agency effects, then here's like a nice intuition that people often get. The water boiled, so someone boiled the water, bad inference. The water was boiled, so someone boiled the water, good inference. Like that's just the kind of intuition people get. Um, so something about using the passive voice like sneaks in a silent agent or something like that. That's one analysis. It might not be the right one. But the point was that, it's like a fair test in like, baby science terms, right? Like you don't mess around with a bunch of stuff in the sentence at once. And philosophers of language often like in trying to make their examples funny or like, interesting or something, like they'll have reasonably complicated sentences that will be sensitive to various aspects of the context, and they'll try and draw philosophical implications from them without actually having made sure, like, isn't that an effect of the verb you picked? Isn't that an effect of like um, the particular context you set up? Like, you want to make sure, if you're studying the meaning of conditionals, you don't want it to be following from something other than the conditional, right? Um, so like that skill of coming up with a minimal pair and just trying to really control for everything else that could be changing. I think that's something that like philosophers of language could be more careful about. The other thing is, of course, just like being familiar with the grammatical devices people, use in language. Like, um, you don't want to end up making claims where like isn't it like a deep fact that like we say things like this and then you find out like half the languages in the world do without that feature or something like that, like then it probably isn't a deep fact, right? It's um, so that like at least trying to familiarize yourself with the grammar of a language that isn't English um, is also a good move. People sometimes sort of like fetishize that, I think, though, of like you have to have a breadth of languages, or there are like insights to be had from working on a single language. I don't deny that. But it's just good to know sometimes like you're not hyper fitting very particular data from very particular languages. Um, it's very sad to pick up a philosophy of language paper that's like trying to investigate the meaning of some philosophically interesting thing, and you find it has like 3 or 4 example sentences. Like you having those additional examples, having those cross-linguistic things is just in service of like really isolating the phenomenon, like setting up those controls. You make sure you're like doing the same, you are looking at what you want to be looking at and like not the things that happen to be next to it. So I think that's like that might be my one piece of advice for like actual philosophy of language. The other thing is like it's just always good to know, like it's always good to know more. It's good to know what like people say about language how language works, how there's like actual structure there that constrains meanings. It's not, you don't have to deal with the meanings in pure isolation. Remember that there's the possibility of like silent morphemes floating around that are like affecting whatever you think you're studying, that sort of thing. So like, you know, um, I think I think that's it. But like, I don't know if that's super coherent or super helpful.
No, no, for sure. No, it's something to like keep in mind. I like to try to keep in mind for myself as someone who at least likes reading it. Who knows if I'll ever actually write anything interesting, but it's good to know what like some of the constraints are that would help
Mhm.
make a more like interesting thesis in a paper. I mean, yeah, no, that's very helpful. Okay. Well, good. We got that. I had so many other questions, but happily, we covered plenty of time with lots of interesting stuff. So, um, well, for one thing, first and foremost, thanks for being here and for giving me
No, not
about
at
two and
all.
a half hours now to talk about this. It's super fun. It was great. Anything you want to plug research wise, or I mean, I'll put in the description like your anything you want. You can message me after, but like, blogs, projects, I'll put like your website, where your CV is and everything. But if you want to promote anything else, go ahead. Now's the time.
Um, no, no, nothing springs to mind. This was a pleasure being here. I hope whatever I said was like reasonably clear or helpful, but you know,
It was, or at
uh,
least for me. So hope I'm sure the mass opinion will vindicate that. But yeah, no, thanks for being here, and love to have you back sometime. We can maybe delve more into some stuff. Why linguistics instead of philosophy, and
oh,
languages of thought and whatnot. So
yeah.
some things I forgot to ask, but yeah, thanks again. And
All right.
all right, thanks for watching,
Thanks.
everybody. Check out all of my stuff I'll be linking, and see you next time.